What happened with the railroad, Skoo?
Well, I'm not an expert on it, but what happened was my understanding was that there was discussion out west that there wanted, there's not a stop from Lake Forest to Milwaukee. And I know that was part of the issue and all that. But in order to do that, because freights go down that track as well as passenger trains, is late at night. I'm sure, Pete, you're probably immune to it now, but you could hear the freights from our houses, right? There was a side track, which typically is what happens. There's a side track when commuters are running, and if it's in line with a freight, they pull to the side and let them go and all that. And I think the issue, and Randy, you could talk to it more, but was putting a side track, or as they call it, the third rail, out west there in Lake Forest for that purpose, because it to ease the flow, so to speak. But I think it also grew into this big, gigantic
But wasn't
issue.
that
But
like a federal problem, the railroad's problem, that we want to spend money that's not our problem? What, Dr. Tack, what happened?
It's a very long story, and it starts to my understanding, somewhere around 2012, which was when I began as an alderman. And there's no relationship between me being an alderman and starting. Okay, just so we know. I believe that the origin of this was WISDOT and IDOT were very interested in developing enhanced Amtrak service between Chicago and Milwaukee. Okay. And Lake Forest at that time, hearing of this interest, began engaging in the idea of having an Amtrak stop on the west side, which would have been nice, right? You could go to the west side and take the train up to Mitchell Airport and
you got to go down Glenview now.
Right? Yeah, right now you'd have to go to Glenview to get on the Amtrak, right? Not very convenient. You might as well just go to O'Hare and get on the plane, right? A proposal from WISDOT and IDOT for enhanced commuter rail service. But as they got into this, they started doing environmental studies and other studies that looked into it. And as I understand it, there was an issue with the volume of freight traffic. That Canadian Pacific line, which is the Milwaukee Road line, is a very heavily utilized freight corridor. And in order to do these other things, there was this idea that you might have to get freight rail off at certain times to allow passenger rail to bypass. So there were numerous different proposals that were floated. One, as I understand it, was a continuous third track from Chicago to Milwaukee, which is a huge project. Nobody had any money to do it. All passenger and freight rail is governed by federal authorities, something called the Surface Transportation Board and the Federal Rail Authority. So nothing can be done with federal or commuter rail interstate that isn't approved at the federal level. And all these rail right-of-ways were given to the railroads in the mid-1800s. Abraham Lincoln was the president when the railroads were given this property, and they were given certain rights. And so this is sort of the elephant in the room with all of this, is that municipalities don't have a lot of authority over commuter or freight traffic that runs on these right-of-ways. That doesn't mean we can't weigh in on the process, and we should, but we don't actually have jurisdiction over those things. Okay, so this thing was evolving, and somewhere in 2016, as I recall, some of the communities on the west side, particularly Academy Woods, but there's a few others, the residents began hearing of these proposals for this potential, what people call third rail, which was really a holding track being built. And of course, they live right next to these freight tracks, and they didn't really want anything that made that situation worse than it already was for them, which is fair enough, right? So they came to the city and they asked the city to get aggressively involved in opposing this. And their proposal was that the city create a several $100,000 fund to actively fight these proposals. they came to city council meeting en masse. I mean, we had meetings with easily 100 people there getting up, and there was a lot of angry discussion that went, toward the city and a perceived lack of support for their community. The city council grappled with this situation and looked at the merits of getting involved the way the community groups wanted us to get involved, and other alternatives, which included engaging our federal representatives, our state representatives, and representatives of the rail companies. And the city council, after debating this, made a decision. One was a policy decision. We issued a policy statement saying that we were opposed to freight rail expansion on the Canadian Pacific line, and that we would actively work with our partners to oppose this. But our other position was that we did not feel that at that time, under the circumstances, which included the jurisdictional issues, that committing substantial sums of money for consultants and lawyers was in the fiduciary interests of the citizens of Lake Forest. And therefore, we chose not to do that. Now, that being said, another community chose a different pathway. Glenview chose to be more financially involved in this. And here we are now, 5-6 years later, there's still no third track, there's no holding track, there's no proposal to build. I believe that the policy that we established at that time was correct, in the best interests of the city, and it also in the best interests of our constituents on the west side. I believe that the city has been actively engaged in a meaningful way. The city council fairly recently revisited this issue and doubled down on the policy, saying, no, the policy is engagement. This is what works. Committing financial resources to this at this time is not what's necessary. As we sit here today, that's current city policy. If I was the mayor, that would continue to be the city policy, unless the city council, after reviewing whatever new information becomes available, makes an alternative decision.
How much money would that have cost us if we did want to do that?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. It depends on how much money you're willing to commit. But my understanding is, and I actually did a little bit of research recently, I believe that Glenview has spent close to $500,000 on this to date. I would argue that what they've gotten out of that is no greater than we've gotten out of it by engaging in the process. And, listen, engaging doesn't mean just talking to people. We have submitted formal commentary to the boards that are responsible for this. We've done everything that you can do short of hiring lawyers and consultants. And that's actually what has been effective. And we're doing that in conjunction with other communities, not just Glenview. It's not just like Glenview and Lake Forest are the only two who have any interests in this. All the communities along these lines have interests in this.
Positive and negative.
Yeah, exactly.
The CP, or Canadian Pacific, the railroad, they decide they want to do it. Pushback, but is it not their property and their right to do that? They could be bad community citizens, but
yeah, and it's more than just the Canadian Pacific. They're the freight operator, but as I understand it, actually that segment of track is owned by Metra. That used to be the old Milwaukee Road line, and I believe Metra owns the track. So that if it was going to be done, Metra would have to agree to doing it, and then they would have to apply to the federal government with a plan to do it, and they would have to obtain funding to do it. But ultimately, you are correct, as I understand it. And again, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but as I understand it, they do have this right of way that was given to them, and one of their rights is to use that for their business purposes. If they determined that that was an essential business requirement, they could make that proposal, and if approved by the federal government, they could build it.